is we're going to talk about this New Deal and measures that Franklin Roosevelt's going to use to solve some of these issues that we have with the Great Depression. And the number one problem that President Roosevelt needed to deal with when he took office was that of unemployment. So the subtopic to start today out is New Deal measures to solve the issue of unemployment. That was the number one priority of all the problems we had after the Depression. He had to find somehow to give assistance to the millions of unemployed men so they could have help for their families. Now, you got to remember, by the time he took over the presidency, there were 14 million people out of work. 14 million. That's a lot of people. And he's going to have to come up with some programs of relief for citizens of the United States to get this problem taken care of. So again, the most urgent task that was facing President Roosevelt when he took office was to provide assistance to the millions of unemployed men and their families. And at the time Roosevelt took office as president, nearly 14 million people were out of work in the United States. And so the Roosevelt administration is going to immediately launch a program of relief for citizens of the United States. So Congress passed a law called the Federal Emergency Relief Act. The Federal Emergency Relief Act. And they distributed more than $3 billion to help needy Americans. Now, someone in the other class asked me, where'd that $3 billion come from? Where did it come from? Taxes, absolutely. Taxes. Now, in those days, I would say that we always talk about there's so many tax breaks for the wealthy. Do you hear that in politics today? They didn't have a lot of tax breaks for the wealthy back in those days, so who was paying the biggest brunt of this? Wealthy people. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. So anyway, Congress passes the Federal Emergency Relief Act. They are going to distribute more than $3 billion to needy Americans. Now this is interesting how they did this, because this money, this $3 billion, was spread out among individual states. So the state of Carver got so much federal money. The state of Baumstark got so much money. And then what the state did once they got the money, there were two ways they could use it. Okay? They could either give direct relief to the unemployed, or they could provide jobs for the unemployed. Again, Congress passes the Federal Emergency Relief Act that distributes more than $3 billion to needy Americans. This money would be distributed to individual states, the amount obviously based on the population, allowing state and local governments to use the money either as direct relief for the unemployed or to provide jobs for the unemployed. So Naya, what is direct relief?
Everyone who's unemployed a certain amount of money for...
Right, and would they have to pay that back?
Probably.
No, they did not. So direct relief is a handout. Okay, so states could say, okay, Peyton, you're unemployed, your family's hurting. Here, I'm just going to give you $500, or I'm going to give you a job in which you could earn $500. Those were the two options. Well, back in those days, most families didn't want direct relief. Why? What's that? Maybe not last long, but why not? What would be more of a factor?
So that they could get money.
Well, why would
Pride.
pride? Very good. Most people had pride, and they weren't interested in a handout. They saw it as a handout. So most families, although many families took direct relief, but because they had to. I mean, they were in dire straits. Although families took direct relief, most families didn't want it, and if they took any, they normally didn't take much and would rather have a job. So what happened when the federal government figured out that most people were not interested in direct relief, which would be a lot different than today, I just have a feeling, the government made arrangements to move away from direct relief and move towards creating jobs. So they started taking their money and investing it in the creation of jobs rather than giving people just a handout, because that's what the American people were telling them. Again, I want to emphasize, that didn't mean that Americans didn't take it, because some of them were in dire straits and needed it, but they might take it until they could kind of get their feet on the ground, and then they wanted a job. They wanted to earn it. Nobody was into direct relief too much. Well, the first step in moving away from direct relief and moving toward creating jobs happened in 1935 when Congress created the Work Progress Administration. In 1935, Congress established the Work Progress Administration. So the first step in moving away from direct relief and moving toward creating jobs happened in 1935 with the creation of the Work Progress Administration. Now, under the direction of Harry L. Hopkins, the WPA used $6.3 billion from Congress to create jobs in the following three areas. I'll repeat that again. The first step in the direction of moving from direct relief to creating jobs was the creation of the Work Progress Administration, 1935, and under the direction of Harry L. Hopkins, the WPA used $6.3 billion that was appropriated from Congress to create jobs in the following three areas. Now, I want you to think in general, this is not an easy question, although second period did pretty good. They got 2 out of 3. So what might be an area that you could do something or construct something that would do everybody a lot of good that would employ people?
Roads.
Very good. Approximately 128,000 miles of secondary roads were either replaced or built new or fixed. What are secondary roads, Rachel?
Not a main road, like not a highway.
Okay, and you look at Warland, that little road that goes off Road 13 that takes you kind of back around and by the little creek there and takes you on the road to Thermopolis, that's a secondary dirt road. Actually, the highway from Warland to Thermopolis could be designated as a secondary road because it's not a main highway like an interstate, but we didn't have interstates in those days. So secondary roads were mainly roads that got you quicker from point A to point B, and what they did is they basically either built or they improved approximately 128,000 miles of secondary roads. And that gave a lot of people jobs, right? It takes people to do that. Okay, what might be another bit of construction that might be done that would help maybe everybody?
Buildings.
What type specifically? You're right.
Skyscrapers.
No, think more
Homes?
local. No,
Business.
City halls.
Small business.
you're getting close.
Jails?
Schools, very good. The construction of schools. There were many new schools either built or repaired under the Work Progress Administration. And did that employ people? Certainly did. So schools were either rebuilt or repaired during this time, which caused a lot of jobs. The third one's a little bit tougher, but I'll give you a little hint. The second period picked it up after the hint. I have a little problem. I'm just tired of that detour down there on Bighorn and 15th Street. What are they doing there?
Bridge.
No? What are they doing there where they got that all tore up? Anybody know?
They're actually making plumbing
Okay, what type of lines?
sewer lines.
There you go. One thing that needs a lot of work in an infrastructure of a community are the sewer lines. So what happened under this Work Progress Administration is they either built sewage plants and new sewer systems in 5,000 different communities across the United States. So they picked these communities that needed new sewer systems and sewer plants, and they put them in, hiring many people to do that. So again, there's 3 specific areas that the Work Progress Administration used their $6.3 billion was to build new secondary roads or improve them, about 128,000 miles worth, new schools or repairing of schools that were in need of repair, and then sewage plants and sewer systems in about 5,000 communities across the United States. Now this started in 1935. By March of 1936, they had 4 million people working just in the Work Progress Administration. 4 million people were employed. A pretty good chunk, huh? That was a very successful program. The Work Progress Administration under the direction of Harry L. Hopkins. All right. A bigger problem in the area of unemployment involved young Americans in the United States. Young Americans. Now, I'll give you a little idea here. I'm a little bit older. But my father graduated from 8th grade. That is it. Now, it kind of cracks me up a little bit because I'm a little critical, but, you know, 8th grade graduation is the most overplayed thing in the world right now. It doesn't mean anything. They had 8th grade graduation in the old days, like when my dad went to 8th grade, because lots of kids only got that far. That was kind of like graduating, you know, from high school. Why didn't they go any farther at this time in history?
They didn't work.
They had to work. Yeah, had no money. They had to go to work. That's what happened to my dad. My grandparents owned a small farm in Dighton, Kansas, and my dad went to school till he was in 8th grade, and that was the end of it, because he had to go to work to make ends meet. Okay? And so what happened is a lot of young Americans were out of work. Okay? And they were forced to leave high school and college because they didn't have the funds to stay in school. So if you actually made it through high school, you had a hard time going to college in these days because you had no money. But even if you're a high school student, it's not like it was today. Your families were hurting, and they'd get you through about the 8th grade, and then it was time to go to work and help the family out. Well, it became a big problem because there wasn't any jobs when they needed to go to work. So 3 other specific agencies were formed just to employ young Americans, to get them off to a start so when they grew up and had a family, got married and had kids, they'd be off to a good start, not a bad start, because they were probably going to get married and have kids anyway. That's what people do, and they didn't want them to be unemployed. So they really concentrated on the young men in America, because they were forced to leave high school or college because they had no funds to stay there. The first agency that was established to bring work to young Americans was the Civilian Conservation Reforestation Act. Okay? The Civilian Conservation Reforestation Act. Now what the Civilian Conservation Reforestation Act did is obviously it put young Americans to work. What would they be doing in a reforestation act?
Planting trees.
What?
Planting trees.
Yeah, they would be conserving the natural resources in America. Okay? They might be planting trees or doing some things that would make our natural resources kept rather than used. The Civilian Conservation Reforestation Act was a law that put young Americans to work ensuring that the natural resources in the United States would be conserved. Probably the best known program, not only in the New Deal, but also in this youth movement for jobs, was the Civilian Conservation Corps. Anybody heard of that?
The CCC.
CCC, very good. The CCC. And it was kind of interesting because it specifically hired single men between the ages of 18 and 25. They specifically hired single men between the ages of 18 and 25. Now, during one time, more than 500,000 young men were enrolled in the CCC. Almost all were poverty-stricken. And they wanted to get them off to a good start in life, so they started the Civilian Conservation Corps. Now, on this particular instance, Jaden mentioned one example of the work they completed, planting trees. Anybody else guess what they might be doing? Somebody said it earlier, but it wasn't quite right. Building bridges. Somebody said building bridges. What else might they do? What else might they do? Might dig reservoirs. They might build fire trails. Although we wouldn't understand it around here, they cleared swamps. They built dams. They cleared land. All these things to help conserve America's natural resources. So they planted trees, dug reservoirs, built bridges, built fire trails, cleared swamps, built dams, cleared land, made parks, like parks you see in town here, Kiwanis Park, I don't know if it was done by the CCC, but that would be an example of where that land was cleared and they put a nice park in. Probably the best example of what the CCC did in this area happens in northeastern Montana. See this great big reservoir right here? It's called Fort Peck Dam and Fort Peck Reservoir. Man-made reservoir. Look how big that is. You look on the map and you see some of these bodies of water. There's Yellowstone Lake, and here's another Flathead Lake. Look at the amount of water that flies out of the Missouri River on Fort Peck. Very big plant for electricity, fishing, recreation, etc. This is probably the biggest example of what the CCC did in this area was Fort Peck Reservoir in Montana. And it had a lot of people working and kept people from being unemployed. The third piece that was put together to help create jobs for the youth of America was called the National Youth Administration. The National Youth Administration. And that was created also in 1935. And this was kind of an interesting concept. It gave federal money to needy students that were both in high school and college. Gave money to needy students who were both in high school and college. That means they didn't do what yet?
Work.
No, or drop out. You're right, they'll drop out. Well, what was this going to do though? Think about what we're saying here. So these guys have not dropped out of high school or college, and so what are we going to do with these youths? We're going to give them jobs while they're what? In high school and college, and the jobs are going to be work around the schools and colleges that they attend. So students were paid regular wages for working at their high schools or working at their colleges, performing tasks in and around their school. We kind of have this today, although it's not the same program. When you get your financial aid package from your college, you might get this as part of it. What would that be?
Librarian?
No, well, maybe, but what's it called? Work or study. Yeah, and so like when I went to college, they said, you have $3,000 worth of work study that we're going to provide you. They give you a job on campus, and you earn that $3,000. Now, if you choose not to go to work, you lose the money. It brings me to another story. This friend of mine, who is the athletic director of Rocky Mountain College, my alma mater, he has a lot of work study students that he hires to take tickets at games or sell programs or do these, help him set up for football games and stuff. And that's part of their financial aid package, and they earn that money on campus and it's part of their deal. This was similar to that, only it was money that was paid to them that they probably could have used for college or high school or used to survive. But does it make sense? And it was very, very successful. During the first year this was in existence in 1935, more than 400,000 young Americans were taking advantage of this program and earning money. More than 400,000 young Americans were working for the National Youth Administration around their high schools and colleges. So they could stay in school rather than have to drop out. Good program. So Roosevelt's got it going here. He really does. Now, that's going to take us to our next subtopic, which doesn't have anything to do with the Great Depression. It has to do with Negroes and the New Deal. Now, so we're politically correct. The proper name to call a African American during the 40s and 50s and 60s and even into the 70s was a Negro. Okay? Now the other N word is one you don't use, very disgraceful thing to use, but Negroes was acceptable. What is more acceptable now if you don't call somebody African American?
Black.
You call them black. It's kind of interesting because the senior class, and you'll have a chance next year to visit with Tommy Smith. He's the guy in the protest of the 1968 Olympics over there under the Beatles poster, guy in the middle with his hand up, and we were talking to him about his protest, and he made it clear to the kids that Negro was okay, an old-fashioned term. The new term for African Americans is black, and that's not offensive. It was kind of funny because he kind of made that clear with them, because I don't think he knew a lot about Wyoming, you know what I'm saying, and their thoughts on African American people. So it's kind of interesting. So just so you know, Negroes is proper at this point. Now, as you can imagine, during the early stages of the New Deal, discrimination in both the workforce and in housing for black people was occurring. No question about it. So during this New Deal, where we're trying to get everybody back on their feet, who's being discriminated against as far as getting jobs and having a place to live? Black people, or Negroes. That's exactly right. Now, for the first time in American history, Negroes begin to publicly fight for their legal and constitutional rights. Before, they just kind of sat back and took it. But during the mid-1930s, because of discrimination in hiring and discrimination in housing for blacks, they began to speak out for the first time publicly about, we have legal rights. We have constitutional rights. And what happened is black leaders started to be formed and getting these groups behind them to complain a little bit. I wouldn't say protest yet, but to complain about how they were treated. Now, one of the first philosophies, especially in northern cities, is when black leaders organized groups of Negroes and had the comment, "Don't buy where you can't work," which is on your ID sheet. And if "don't buy where you can't work" is pretty simple, saying what? Or don't purchase things from a grocery store that is not hiring black people. So that was kind of the first, in a way, protest of what's not yet the civil rights movement, is when black leaders encouraged Negroes at the time, "Don't buy where you can't work" campaign. Don't go buy goods at a place that they're not going to let you work at. Does that make sense? And that was kind of the first time that we had a little bit of a protest. Now, another thing that happened in 1935 is a group called the National Negro Congress was established. In 1935, the National Negro Congress was established. What do you think they did, Lily? What did the National Negro Congress do?
They discussed topics.
Okay, I'll give you that. But if I'm not treating you right in class, Lily, if your mom maybe thinks that I'm not treating you right, you go and say, "Mom, gee, Mr. Durr was really mean to me today," she's going to come up to school and advocate for you with me, right? What does that mean? Speak for me. Say, "Gee, my daughter's a really nice girl. She works hard. She does all the work